During the 5 weeks of Lent, I often spoke about the process by which those who were interested in being baptized went through a series of steps. Making the decision to be baptized, to join the company of Jesus, was not to be taken lightly. And so this process, or that process of 5 weeks, led them to look inside of themselves, to consider deeply what they were going to have to change in their life in order to be followers of Jesus. I can only imagine, since so many of us were baptized as infants, as to what the experience might have been like for them as adults. Maybe already 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years into their lives, what that might have been like coming finally at the end of 5 weeks, standing before the whole community, being plunged into the waters, in a sense remembering what it was like to die with Christ, and then to be brought up out of the waters, to be clothed in white and anointed with oil. That experience in itself must have been very powerful, earth-shaking for many of them. Well, what happens is, and it's true for many of us, in whatever experience that is a fabulous experience or a fantastic experience, even like getting married, right? That experience is something that if we don't take some time following the experience, take some time reflecting on it, considering what did all of this mean? What was all this about? That it kind of just stays on the top of our heads. That it's not something that filters down into our lives to the depth of who we are as human beings. I'm convinced that one of the challenges we have as Americans is we don't really take time to reflect on the experiences of our lives. We live in a time, right, where instant news comes on, right? Remember when CNN started up? It was like it took maybe days to find out some of the things that happened. And now CNN is right there on the spot, right at the instant, and we get news instantly. And then they go on into the next news story, and you don't even have time to consider what has just happened, what's going on. And so experiences as traumatic or as fantastic as being baptized need some time to reflect, need some time to consider what was this about? What just happened to me? What does it mean for my life as I continue to live it? And so in the wisdom of the early church, the time following Easter up to the time of Pentecost, and here, by the way, if anybody comes knocking on your door and wants to share anything about Scripture with you, just give them this. This is $100 theological word I'm going to give to you today. $100. The word is mystagogia. How about that for your morning? Huh? Mystagogia means the study of the mysteries. And so those who were recently baptized or received into the fellowship of Jesus spent not 40 days, but now spent 50 days reflecting on the meaning of that moment in their life or baptism. And so the mystagogia was, well, what did this about? What just happened to me? What does it really mean to me? And you did it now because you were joined to the community. You did this in the context of community. Early in the church, oftentimes that people had to wait who were baptized, they had to wait in the narthex. That's why it's called the narthex. It was outside the church. You could only look in through the windows to see what was going on. But now, having been received fully into the community, now you were in the midst of it. Well, it always feels different, doesn't it? When you're looking from the outside, and now when you are experiencing it from the inside. What's different about that? And you ask questions. So that the time of mystagogia was the time when you could ask questions and have the community there for your support, to have the community perhaps answer the questions or at least help you find them. Remember in the story today, Jesus breaks open the Scripture for them because maybe it was just something that they heard all their lives, but they really didn't know what the meaning of it was. And so this time, even for us, the time of the 50 days from Easter to Pentecost is a time to reflect on what all of this means to us in terms of Easter. The first few Sundays following Easter, last week, this week, and maybe next week, is a time when we hear these stories about resurrection. Because the question is, well, what is resurrection about? What happened? And remember, in the early community, those who were eyewitnesses, all they saw was an empty tomb. Well, now they go, and you know how it even is said today, it's astounding. Some women come and tell us. Well, who can trust them, right? Who can trust the women to tell us the story? We want to see for ourselves, and so they all... Well, the empty tomb isn't enough to convince them about resurrection. And so as the tradition begins to develop in the early Christian community, there are now various stories about Jesus appearing in different places. He appears here, he appears there, he goes here. And pretty soon you get the idea that the people are now looking at resurrection as something that really is concrete and physical. Not just for Jesus, but for anyone who has been joined into Jesus through baptism, that resurrection will happen for them too. So in the first weeks are stories about resurrection and resurrection appearances. And then the shift happens in the middle of the 50 days, then the reflection is, so who is this Jesus now? If he's been resurrected, who is he? He's more than just the Messiah. He's more than just the crucified one. And so various images will be given to us as to who Jesus is now as the resurrected one in our midst. And then towards the end of the Mystagogia, or towards the end of those 50 days, we begin to talk about the Spirit. Because what has to happen for us is that we get all of this information, and maybe we begin to make the changes in our lives, but we need something to empower us, to be breathed into us in terms of the Spirit of God, so that we really do add something more than just to the verbal commitment. We add to the physical commitment to live in the world, and that will be Pentecost when we come down at the beginning of June to it. So that's what Mystagogia is about, right? So now you go outside the church and you're going to start talking about Mystagogia to other people, right? Sure, right? Well, what's interesting is that if you think about it, we celebrated Easter, and the joy of what resurrection and Easter is about. And then last week, we had the rabbi speak, and we had a reflection on what the Holocaust is about. It kind of, for me anyway, took a little bit of the joy of Easter out, because reflecting on the Holocaust was not something that was filled with much joy. But I want to consider it this way. You know what? We live our lives between those two events. We live our lives between the event of Jesus' resurrection and the fact that people's lives were not changed or transformed. And we see the result in that violence of the Holocaust. That's kind of where we are. Every day, right? Just listen to the news. We know that somehow or another resurrection has transformed us or is intended to transform us, and yet every day we become either the victims of or unwilling participants in the violence of the world around us. What do we do with that? How do we manage to keep the faith and have an understanding that Jesus has transformed us when more and more of the world that we live in is filled with acts of violence and terror that we see as Saul perpetrated in the Holocaust, but we see almost each and every day. Just watch the stories out of Syria. Listen to the stories of some of the refugees. It doesn't seem like the world at all has been transformed or changed, at least in the West anyway. And so there we are, between resurrection and Holocaust. Well, how do we live our lives? Well, it's interesting that one part of this story today suggests that it is in the way that the community, and remember, they're kept from recognizing Jesus. Perhaps because they're still, before the resurrection, they're still filled with despair or hopelessness. They're still somehow not figuring out what had happened in and through Jesus. They're still uncertain about what their discipleship is about. But one of the things that in the story that was told is on Easter it said, remember when they went to the tomb and they were instructed? He goes ahead of you to Galilee. Go there and you will see him. I'm sure that what they thought they were going to do is indeed go to Galilee and Jesus would be waiting there for them. But I want to suggest that what they saw when they went back to Galilee was not Jesus, but they saw everyone whose lives had encountered Jesus, and who, because of that encounter with Jesus, their lives had been changed. Peter's mother-in-law, who Jesus touched, the lepers that Jesus touched, the people who had been restored to the fullness of their dignity to live in the community. The reason why I suggest those things is, you see, if we go back to Galilee thinking that we're going to see Jesus just as he was, then it's possible that we actually will miss the people whose lives have really been transformed and changed. And so each one of those people that they go back and encounter, the question can be, what happened to you? Well, Jesus touched me. Jesus healed me. And you see, what happens is that it's the personal story that begins to be told, no longer really about Jesus, but the personal story gets told of how they have been resurrected, how they have been made whole, how their lives have been changed and transformed. So one thing that happens between Easter and the Holocaust is, maybe we need to tell more of those kinds of stories. Maybe we need to be telling stories when so much of the media has one murder after another, one crime after another, then maybe we need to try to just listen to the stories of hope, of healing, of transformation and change. Oh, they pop up every once in a while on the news, don't they? But not often enough. One of my friends who was a writer for the Arizona Republican, if I was getting into any trouble with the diocese, I would call him up and say, hey, maybe you need to put this in the newspaper. And of course, he would be more than happy to put whatever was going on that I was struggling with or in controversy, because he said that's really what people want to hear is controversy. Right? Because I asked him, how come you never tell the good stories? Oh, people get bored with those stories. You see, it's sort of like this. If you want to be a happy person, who do you associate with? Happy people. If you associate with angry people, that's how you're going to turn out to be, is angry all the time. So the idea is that between Easter and the Holocaust, the stories have to be told of change and transformation. Remember how the effect that's seen in the movie Schindler's List? I didn't know there were any people called righteous Gentiles. That there were people who had sheltered and had risked their own lives to save other people from the Holocaust. I didn't know that story. But now knowing that story, you begin to hear more stories like that. You see that becomes, in the telling of the personal story, becomes the vehicle for changing and transforming the hate and the violence of the world. That if we can fill that space between Easter and Holocaust with stories of transformation and change that we ourselves tell, then there isn't going to be room for the stories of violence and terror and hate. Another part of it is in this story today, and this is where, unfortunately, because we only do communion once a month, we don't really get the impact of this. But in communities where communion happens every Sunday, notice what the story said today. That he was like going to go on, and they invite him to stay, and this was a struggle in the early community. Don't you wish your loved ones would stay? Why do they have to leave? And yet when Jesus goes in to sit down at the meal, the words should echo in he takes the bread. How often had they seen him do that? He blesses the bread. How often did they hear the blessing? And he breaks the bread. And the scripture said, at that moment their eyes were open. Did they see Jesus at that instant? Or did they see and recognize that in the breaking of the bread, their lives were now being broken open? And indeed, not only had healing come for them, but life had come for them. So that in communities where communion is celebrated on a regular basis every Sunday, you see, you have the opportunity to come to understand that in the breaking of this bread, just like we do here once a month, that in the breaking of that bread, Jesus is really and truly present in our midst. Not in the bread and the juice or the wine, but in each one of us. Because when we take in that bread and drink from that cup, that the presence of the risen Christ becomes a part of us. And what that's intended to do is not to make it a private thing between me and Jesus, but rather it's meant to be the source of energy for us as a community, to be instruments for the breaking open of that good news that God has brought to us in and through Jesus. So that not only do we need to tell the stories, but we need to bring those stories into the midst of the breaking of the bread with us, so that in opening up those stories, we're unleashing or taking the top off of the very powerful gift of God's grace and God's love in the world. That's what happens between Easter and the Holocaust. But one final part of it is, we have to make sure that not only in our individual experience of what the risen life is about, but in the experience of our community, that we have to be committed. We have to be committed. And here's the lesson from the Holocaust. We have to be committed to never let that kind of thing happen again. We have to be committed to making sure that we always will stand with those who are oppressed, with those who are victims of violence, with those who continue to experience prejudice and discrimination against them for whatever reason, that we have to make sure, as some have often said, that we're on the right side of history. And what that means is that if God is a God who is working liberation and freedom and healing, we have to stand as a force with that power for liberation and healing. We have to do that. That's what the commitment of discipleship is about. So the change and transformation that happens in the world will happen because we're committed to changing the world. That it's not a private experience of faith between me and Jesus, but indeed it's a powerful force for compassion and mercy and healing in the world. We have to make sure that we're committed to that path. That's what it means to be on the road to Emmaus. Be on the road to turning our backs on violence and terror and hate and prejudice, and turning our faces towards the powerful way in which God brings hope and life to the world.